I've spent my life sort of surrounded by facts and figures and rational policy processes, and I'm kind of a recent convert to the world of stories. And my conversion to the world of stories came as a parent. Several years ago, I was on holiday in the Scilly Isles. I don't know if anyone's been to the Scilly Isles. They're a magical and rather wonderful place. And I was putting my daughter to bed one night, and in the rush of packing, we'd sort of left all our storybooks at home. And she said, "Daddy, tell me a story." Oh. I don't know any stories. I don't know if you've ever tried to tell a story when you've never done this before, but it really makes your brain ache. Because she kept saying things like, so I'd say something, and I'm hoping that she'd be going off to sleep, and then she'd look at me and go, "And then what happened?" And I was helped by the fact that on this particular little island in the Scilly Isles, there was a lighthouse on the horizon, and every few seconds it sort of swept the curtains with light, and there was this beautiful sense. And when you're on these little tiny islands, the weather, sea weather, you get sea weather, which means it changes by the moment. It can be brilliant sunshine one minute and kind of deep, thick fog the next. So it's kind of very good place for stories. Anyway, I kind of looked into stories. Now, as a direct consequence of that one experience, anyway, so I kind of got through the story on the first night and then thought I got away with it. And then it came to bedtime the next day, and she looked at me and said, "And then what happened?" And this went on for several days. Now, the product of that ended up in, because this became, after the event, a bit of a revelation for me. And I started speaking with some of my friends who sort of work in the same sort of rational policy world of economics and all that stuff that I do. We said, there's this world out there where you can write things that don't need footnotes or references. So we kind of got together, and we published a collection of tales, which we called "There Was a Knock at the Door," and then we published 2 more collections of tales. And all my friends, we're kind of in agreement. This is the most fun we've ever had with words. And in as I started to look into stories, I sort of stumbled across the fact they don't even need to be very long. And I came across kind of the shortest ghost story in the world, which went something like, "The last person in the world sat alone in a room. There was a knock at the door." So I might sum up kind of what I'm going to be talking about in a similar way by saying, it's something like the fate of the world appeared sealed, and then a voice came over the radio. Because even though I'm going to talk about some kind of facts and figures, I'm even going to mention studies, it is a bit of a story for me. I feel, in a sense, it's a story of my own life. I grew up in Essex. I'm a child of Thatcher's Britain. I'm a child of the era of neoliberal economics. That means I grew up with people waving cash in your face and buying bigger cars and bigger houses to establish their place in the world. And there was a story on the radio this morning about they've been getting more papers out of the Thatcher archives. And I don't know if you remember, but she said a very telling thing. For all the way that the economic right like to kind of dress themselves in sort of objectivity and rationalism, remember that it was Margaret Thatcher who said in 1981 that economics are just the method. The object is to change the heart and soul. So much of what we're dealing with today has been the result of something that dressed itself up as an economic project, but was really about re-engineering human souls. And they did that by telling a particular type of story. And obviously, I think we need to tell a different kind of story. And what I'm going to go through today is why I think there's actually, not that you should need to rely upon footnotes and references, there's actually a really solid, hope-filled evidence base about why we are more than this. And the economic myths that we've been living with for the last few decades may actually, in a good way, evaporate, be burnt off by the morning sun as a kind of bad dew, you might think. Anyway, I think, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think you're very brave. Everything feels very biblical at the moment, what with pandemics and floods and Brexit and all the rest of it. Everything feels like it's falling apart. What sort of scent should you wear when everything's falling apart? Well, not long ago, there was a perfume you could buy for £300 a bottle that was called Apocalypse. It was made from everything mentioned in the book of Revelation that carries a smell. Reportedly, Its chemical scent was one of bile and dread. Now, as I said, there's quite a lot going on at the moment, and I want to explore the sort of bad smell that's coming off mainstream economics and see how it's rubbed off on people, or rather perhaps how we get our noses rubbed in it. Now, you might not know this, but there's a niche in the economics literature that explores the question, does studying economics make you a bad person? There's an academic called Professor Robert Frank. He was one of its early exponents. He is based at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and he was struck by the insistence in economics on the essential selfishness of human nature. And he cites the economist Gordon Tullock, who asserted, I love this, and I quote, "The average human being is about 95% selfish in the narrow sense of the term." Now, that's a great economist trick. You see it quite a lot. It's sort of false precision. Where the hell did he get 95% from? I don't know. But Frank and his colleagues chose to investigate whether the sort of self-interest model of the economy was a reflection of how people, in essence, really were, or whether it was an artificially constructed model that attracted an unrepresentative, more selfish sample of society to its cause, and was actually making people selfish. Now, his troubling conclusion was that the appeal, study, and internalization of neoliberal economic models did indeed select an unrepresentative and more selfish slice of society. And there was a study at the dawn of the Reagan-Thatcher economic revolution which noted that economics undergraduates were more likely to behave selfishly and free ride off the more public-spirited behavior of others. And more recently, a man called Yorick Bauman, he's an environmental economist at the University of Washington, looked at the impact of economics teaching on students who majored in other subjects. Now, what he was able to show was that those who began as part of the more generous majority, not full-time students of economics, actually became more selfish as a result of exposure to studying the dismal science. Now, dismal science is an old term for economics with a complex history. It was coined by a man called Thomas Carlyle, and it was commonly ascribed to his denunciation of Malthusian ideas about the inevitable misery and shortages that would result from population expansion. Now, the truth is actually different, because Carlyle was a racist who believed that slavery was justified by there being so-called subhuman races to whom equal rights did not apply. Now, early economics, conversely, did not provide support to the formal practice of slavery, because at some levels it made claims about there being an essential human nature that we all shared. Now, of course, there's a whole set of different arguments and evidence we can point to about the creation of de facto slavery as a result of the practice of market economics. As an early fellow traveller of neoliberal economics who became disillusioned, a man called Karl Popper, he was the author of a book called Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, he came to believe that, that neoliberalism wasn't actually liberal at all, and that proponents of complete freedom are, in actuality, whatever their intentions, enemies of freedom. That this notion of freedom, paradoxically, would be not only self-destructive, but bound to produce its opposite. For if all restraints were removed, there would be nothing whatever to stop the strong enslaving the weak. And this is a very recent story. It's a story that's only really been with us since a few years after the Second World War. There's a group called the Pelerin Society who gathered in the Swiss town of Pelerin, who actually created the whole school of neoliberal economics. And Popper was there at the outset, and he walked away because he thought it would lead to the opposite. But now, there's another chap called Mark Arvin. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Tampa in the United States. And his work suggests that even calling economics a dismal science could be an understatement. He conducted an experiment looking into the relationship between moral judgments and three dark personality traits: Machiavellianism, i.e. tendencies to deceit, narcissism, an overinflated sense of self-worth, and psychopathy, a lack of guilt and remorse. Now, to do so, he looked at people's beliefs concerning several issues, including economic libertarianism, the notion that the role of the state in relation to the market should be minimal, only intervening to prevent or punish the breaking of the law. And this world is kind of the ideal habit in which so-called economic man is supposed to prosper. But Arvin found that this view correlated significantly with all three dark personality traits. In other words, the projection of an economic system built on foundations of self-interest, individualism, and self-regulation, which is supposed to be good for everyone, in fact describes the habitat for a dark triad of personality dysfunctions, including psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. So the materialism that we live with, which is relied upon by neoliberal markets, displays similarly self-reinforcing and negative dynamics. I can hear that my voice is puffing. Is that all right? Is that still sounding okay, coming through all right? It's been shown in countless studies, summarized by an American academic guy called Tim Kasser. It's a great guy. He wrote a book called The High Price of Materialism. That holding more materialistic values is an indicator of having relatively lower levels of well-being. There's classic studies now which show that merely being exposed to images of fancy consumer goods triggers materialistic concerns, which makes us feel worse and behave more antisocially. Children, for example, exposed to advertising were seen to be less likely to interact socially. There's other studies that show how by simply referring to people as consumers rather than, say, citizens, triggers more competitive and selfish behavior. When you could be exposed to anything from 500 to 3,000 daily cues to think of yourself by being exposed to adverts, it can have a huge cumulative effect, not just on our own well-being, but on others through how we behave towards them. Now, as a psychology professor, Dasha Keltner points to research that shows how image-conscious people who drive the highest social status cars also exhibit the most antisocial behavior on roads. To combat that, to combat what they call the visual pollution of excessive advertising, in 2007, in Brazil's second city, Sao Paulo, led interestingly by a conservative mayor called Gilberto Kassab, they introduced what they called the Clean City Law. The result was a near total ban affecting billboards, digital signs, and advertising on buses. Now, since then, several US states, and in Paris, and in the cities of Chennai and Grenoble, more pioneering attempts to clear away the visual pollution, the stuff which defines us as a certain kind of economic being, have been going ahead. And yet this kind of idea that we can be so conditioned, that we might not be fully in the driving seat of our own lives, can be felt as something of an affront. It can feel like kind of a weakness, an insult to our sense of ourselves. Of course I'm not controlled by the world around me. I am the architect of my own fate. But not only is the evidence overwhelming that our choices are hugely influenced by cues in the environment and the behavior of others, it seems that much of the time, rational economic man is often not making conscious rational choices at all in the way supposed by mainstream economics. Now, there's a debate about the degree to which this applies, but research in neuroscience indicates that many of our choices are made during a sort of pre-conscious brain activity, a mixture of highly subjective, conditioned, and instinctive processes. If anything, the brain can be that kind of friend who, whatever you do and for whatever reason, pats you on the back after the event and says, good call, you took charge and you did the right thing. Now, the doctrine of neoliberalism, it seems, pushes you towards becoming the kind of human being that relies on. This is a study of a kind of a branch of economics seems to behave like an intellectual version of the invasion of the body snatchers, turning the host mind to its own preset purpose. It's a kind of reality by assertion. And this is where kind of the good news comes in the story of ourselves, in which we can start to rewrite things. That there's a deluge of findings in everything from evolutionary biology, anthropology, psychology, ecology, neuroscience that contradict the reduction of humanity to competitive vessels of short-term, self-interested individualism. Because from our primal beginnings, and one of the lovely things about hearing all the myths is you get this sort of, it almost kind of carries the smell on the wind of some of those primal beginnings, other ways of being, that biology reveals that the emergence of life itself on Earth owes as much to processes of symbiosis and association as to competition. Now, this appears to be the case with early evolving bacteria, who are engaged in a kind of giant social networking exercise in which microbiological forms evolved the tricks that still lie at the heart of life today. Nature often is riddled with strategies that contradict the market myth that life is a brutal individual struggle of the survival of the fittest. And even that phrase, the survival of the fittest, has been misappropriated. There are evolutionary victories for symbiosis, for example, in the bacteria that fix nitrogen in plant roots and which consequently makes life possible, and for collaboration, as was the case with the primeval slime mold, which got life going. There's also the coevolution that gave us the pollinating honeybee, responsible for those 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat. And then there is reason itself, another advantage for problem-solving animals, which include, I understand, elephants, dogs, cats, rats, sperm whales, and allegedly human beings. So, in a world where we're witnessing this sort of unhealthy concentration of economic power, of cultural homogenization, optimal diversity, too, is a key condition. It's nature's kind of insurance policy against disaster. And yet we've been regulating the economy in favor of one-sided, competitive individualism. And ironically, in the process, through the failure to control emerging monopoly and oligopoly, allow the spread of monocultures and clone towns that are increasingly vulnerable to a wide range of external shocks. Now, it's quite interesting that from the evidence of the last financial crisis, companies that were cooperatives and mutuals, like the Nationwide and John Lewis, actually survived the financial crisis better than other kinds of firms. But in fact, what seems to make humanity fairly special is our prodigious and skillful capacity for empathy and cooperation. And in this broader view, we are in fact a kind of super cooperator living in an age of empathy. There's a professor of biology and maths at Harvard called Martin Novak. He notes that contrary to the pseudo-Darwinian caricature of animals caught in a death struggle, that mechanisms of cooperation, including direct and indirect reciprocity, are in fact fundamental. From David Hume to Darwin himself and Kropotkin writing in Mutual Aid, the power of cooperation, as opposed to competition, appears as the forgotten story of ourselves. Now, science now shares quite a lot of the truths stumbled on by some of the world's great religions that value unselfish action. Novak writes that they have come to the conclusion that love, hope, and forgiveness are essential components of what is needed to solve the biggest problems. And he says he is struck, perhaps awestruck, by the extent to which humans cooperate. No animal species can draw on the mechanisms of cooperation to the same extent as seen in human society. Empathy is the antithesis of market sociopathy. And the biologist and primatologist Frans de Waal sees this as the great under-recognized human quality, the fact that we are hardwired for altruism. The expression of our ability for empathy has kept society as a whole from falling apart. Feeling for each other in such a way that it shapes mutually supportive rather than competitive behavior is designed in. So to flourish, we need an economics that plays to these extraordinary strengths rather than contradicting and suppressing them. De Waal sees amusing contradictions in the highly selective co-option by mainstream economics of evolutionary theory, just as a rejection of real Darwinism, or refusal to endorse it, washes over the religious conservative branch of the Republican movement, the very same political persuasion promotes a social Darwinism that depicts life as a struggle in which those who make it shouldn't be dragged down by those who don't. Hence, you get this sort of neoconservatives drawing invisibly on early misinterpretations of Darwin's theories and their application to the world of business. It was the philosopher Herbert Spencer, for example, in the 19th century, who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. He thought equality was a bad idea, that it was kind of counterproductive for the fit to feel any obligation towards the unfit. Now, of course, that is a misrepresentation of Darwin, because survival of the fittest meant survival of the best adapted. And of course, survival of the best adapted might mean survival of those who are best at working together. And quite the opposite has been true in practice. Not only is inequality associated with economic disasters, it tends to peak before collapses. It also raises costs to society as a whole across the board, as we can see in the work of Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson and their work on equality. Equality is very productive indeed. It calls on our inborn capacity for empathy. Now, I think it's time for a paradigm shift in which this sort of colossally erroneous notion of economic man, and it is always economic man, is removed from the center of our theoretical solar system, much as the Earth once had to be replaced by the sun to correct a similarly mistaken belief. Because it turns out that one of the greatest barriers to the shift might just be our reluctance to believe in its possibility, our reluctance that itself appears to be based on misunderstandings about how the world actually is, and wrongly second-guessing what other people are truly like. The New Scientist magazine had a piece about this a while ago, in which they pointed out that many theories begin with the idea that inequality is somehow a beneficial cultural trait that imparts efficiencies, motivates innovation, and increases the likelihood of survival. But rather, they go on to point out, than imparting advantages to the group, unequal access to resources is inherently destabilizing and greatly raises the chance of group extinction. So just to say another couple of things. There's a classic thought experiment pointed out by the behavioral economist Dan Ariely. It followed up on another classic experiment by the philosopher John Rawls, in which people were asked to estimate how wealth was actually distributed in the country. And the respondents were broken down according to voter persuasion, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, men and women, high, medium, and low paid. All groups, with very little variation among them, substantially overestimated how equal their society was. They were then told to imagine that they're going to be randomly inserted into an income group in society. It could be the richest, it could be the poorest, it could be somewhere in the middle. And they were asked what they think would be the ideal distribution of wealth in that society. Now, of course, this isn't just hypothetical, because random insertion into an income group is precisely what happens to us when we're born. And in answer to this question, a fascinating thing happens. All the groups across the political spectrum, gender, age, with only very minor variation, they all opted for a substantially more equal distribution of wealth. So perceptions and misperceptions are fundamental to believing in the possibility of change. A great little outfit that you might have come across has become quite a famous example now, called Common Cause. Did another little experiment recently in which they asked people to talk about their own values and also what they thought were the values of others. And regardless of age, geography, wealth, and voting behavior, again, people attached more importance to compassionate values, embracing justice and tolerance and responsibility, than they did to more materialistic values to do with wealth, image, ambition, so-called selfish values. 74% of us, you can trust that fact, that's not false precision, this is a good fact. 74% of us prioritize in this way towards those positive values. But when we're asked what we think are the values that other people hold, it flips. We don't trust other people. We think 70% of them have selfish values. So from the point of view of how human nature smells, we seem to think that the odor from each other is a lot worse than it is, which might partly explain the lack of political enthusiasm for more shared, common, collective solutions to our problems. That we want and need more than the impoverishing view of human nature offered to us by the economic mainstream. And I believe we are much more than that view that it offers. There are much sweeter smells rising from all of you and all around us. So my message, I suppose, on this, well, it was a very wet Saturday. Things have changed already. See how it's looking up? Is that we can wake up and sort of smell the human orange blossom. And that if we do that, many more and great things will become possible. Thanks for listening.